Like an adorable puppy whose glassy-eyed stare injects oxytocin directly into your soul, Mika and the Witch's Mountain is lovable in a way that feels effortless and pure. It leaves an entrancing impression right from the get-go with gorgeously animated, albeit sparse, cutscenes in the style of Studio Ghibli and a pervasive wholesomeness that rarely devolves into the sort of saccharine platitudes one might expect. I mean, really, there's even a literal adorable puppy that occasionally follows you around and rolls over for belly rubs. Who can say no to that? This is an experience with gameplay that's quite simple and arguably shallow, and that automatically makes it not a game for everyone, but to even say as much somewhat misses the point, because despite its early access state, Mika and the Witch's Mountain presented me with a mostly fulfilling experience stacked with interesting characters, a small but vibrant open world to explore, and satisfying traversal that's easy to pick up but slightly demanding to master. Despite a great first impression, I won't pretend this cute puppy doesn't occasionally have an accident or chew up a shoe here or there, but those who've been eager to journey through Mika's world since the early days of its Kickstarter are unlikely to be disappointed. You're also unlikely to be disappointed if you choose to help out the channel by liking, subscribing, and checking out our Patreon in the link below to get some cool perks. And as always, if live stream indie games are more your thing, don't forget to join Gamer Ghoulfriend on YouTube or Twitch every Tuesday and Thursday. Mika and the Witch's Mountain doesn't waste much time on exposition, opening with a cutscene barely 30 seconds long that shows her being dropped off by her mother at the Stellar Lighthouse, where she'll learn the ins and outs of being a witch by the imposing Miss Olagari, whose chosen approach to Witching 101 is to throw Mika off a mountain like a baby bird and force her to learn how to fly her way back up. While knocking the protagonist off a cliff is an arguably controversial way to start a wholesome adventure, it won't be long before Mika wanders her way into the company of the charming townsfolk below, who will help repair and upgrade her broom as well as give her the wisdom and practice to be able to properly fly it. Even in this endearing world, however, nothing tends to come free, as Mika will have to practice her flying by delivering packages from one place to another, which serves as a mighty fine excuse to learn about the town's denizens and what makes them tick. Thankfully, Mika exceeds expectations in this regard. I was mostly anticipating some endearing but shallow one-liners with focus on a broader narrative, but while the overarching story delivers in its own way by the conclusion of its 3 to 4 hour runtime, the bulk of that time is focused on the smaller tales of a painter struggling to find his muse, a fisherman longing to sail the open seas but worried about leaving his aging father behind, or the owner of an ice cream stand experimenting with some wild and crazy flavors. Its focus on more intimate stories is one of Mika's greatest strengths, even if its currently brief runtime makes some of the arcs feel abrupt, and in a couple of cases, lacking a satisfying resolution. The Steam store page of Mika and the Witch's Mountain claims the main content of the story is already in place, and seems to make no clear commitments of expanding it beyond adding some side quests, minigames, and dungeons, but I'd love to see some character stories elaborated a bit and some extra ones introduced. Even so, what's here is really solid and feels appropriately Ghibli-esque in the treatment of its characters. I've referenced Studio Ghibli a couple of times now, so may as well address the elaborately animated elephant in the room and say that the premise of Mika and the Witch's Mountain is incredibly similar to one of the studio's older films, Kiki's Delivery Service. But if imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, Mika is complimenting the classic film just enough to pay appropriate homage without losing its own identity in the process. Mika and the Witch's Mountain is certainly not a movie though, so let's talk about how it plays. It's tempting to view it as a 3D platformer given its focus on traversing from point A to B to deliver packages to the townsfolk, but I'd say it's about as much a platformer as a Jolly Rancher is a fruit. It may have some of the same flavor on the surface, but nobody would mistake it for the real thing. Not to say it's trying to be a platformer though, because in most cases, I'd sooner compare Mika to Death Stranding than anything else. You know, minus the death and the strands and weird invisible monsters and stuff. The primary objective of Mika and the Witch's Mountain is to deliver packages in whatever way damages them the least. Each delivery will have a health meter and certain conditions to avoid, like allowing it to touch water or hitting it against a cliff. You know, the sort of stuff FedEx likes to do for fun. Traversing the landscape will constantly require the use of various horizontal and vertical wind tunnels throughout the game, some of which you'll thoroughly rely upon early on when your broom can't do much more than gently glide downward and give a little hop when you're near the ground. As you progress, you'll get a couple of better brooms to allow you to fly faster and trigger a bit of a boost, one that changes traversal just enough to open up more options as you get your bearings with the unique flight controls. I say unique because I didn't really love them at first. Flying felt quite restrictive, and having to do things like circle your broom around a vertical wind tunnel to stay within its reach could occasionally feel clunky. I got used to it though, and as I made my way from delivery to delivery, got better at knowing the right time to utilize a jump or a boost to make an efficient path forward while keeping my packages intact. And this was satisfying to do in a personal accomplishment sort of way, but I should probably give a warning that most of it doesn't really matter. There were plenty of instances where I accidentally dipped a package that couldn't get wet in the ocean, and it was not any bit worse for wear. Similarly, there were several times where I got caught in a wind tunnel and slammed my package against a wall hard enough that it would lose health or break entirely. There's a rating system in place for each delivery where you'll earn a green, yellow, or red stamp accordingly, but this ultimately doesn't matter, as once you're past a certain point in the game early on, I couldn't figure out what currency really did. There are some collectibles you can find around the world that act as a different sort of currency, allowing you to buy costumes or charms for your broom, but from what I could tell at least, they were, for better or worse, all form and no function. This lack of real consequences for anything you do isn't necessarily a problem for a game that aims to be primarily charming and stress-free. In fact, it's fair to argue that it's kind of the point, but those looking for a more mechanically fulfilling experience are definitely checking out the wrong game. Mika and the Witch's Mountain is all vibes. Bright, cheery, positive vibes, and it delivers those in spades. That said, despite the short runtime, I couldn't help but feel that repetition set in during the third act, which required numerous deliveries traversing over the same areas I had flown through repeatedly already. This open world is quite small, and that's not a complaint, but more unique traversal paths or interesting things to find in it would have gone a long way to prevent the core gameplay from getting stale. The game has side deliveries to work on if you want something to do in addition to the story, and these can be tackled either alongside the main quest or after the credits roll. That said, I didn't find these especially compelling, as they generally involve doing the exact same thing as the main quest, but without much of a narrative pull. Completionists might enjoy having some more to do given that the game is so short, but I won't pretend its methods of extending runtime are especially interesting. What is especially interesting though is its presentation, which pulls no wholesome punches even as an early access game. Mika and the Witch's Mountain has a fantastically colorful aesthetic bolstered by cute and detailed animation, which is all as charming and inviting as it looks. Well, mostly. There are parts of Mika's world that are mysteriously brown and barren in a way that implies some greater involvement with the plot, but at least in the game's current state, are barely utilized as more than a less pretty patch of land to fly over. Most of the game looks really great though, and I have to stress that despite the developer saying they have some performance issues to fix in the early access section of the Steam store page, I personally don't think they're giving themselves enough credit. I think I had one temporary moment of frame rate drops on my rig, which lasted about 3 seconds. The game has fantastic ultrawide support, which is always lovely to see, and its Steam Deck performance was, not to be dramatic, but kind of astounding. I played Mika on the Steam Deck OLED model at default settings, and it ran at an almost completely locked 90 frames per second the entire time and looked fantastic in the process. Given the number of worse looking non-open world 3D indie titles that struggle to maintain 60 FPS on the deck, I would say the optimization work here is pretty fantastic, and I didn't encounter any bugs to speak of, which for an early access game is pretty noteworthy. The music is also really fantastic. Several different themes play as you fly your way around Mika's world, and I would say not a single one was anything but great. If I had any complaints at all about the music, it's that it would occasionally cut out entirely for long stretches of time, leaving only ambient noise and the sound of wind tunnels, which on their own were strangely ominous at times. I hope this will be addressed in a future patch, but for the time being, it's not terribly distracting, even if it happens somewhat frequently. Overall, I am tremendously impressed with Mika and the Witch's Mountain given its launch into early access. The story is quite short and a bit on the repetitive side, and there are a number of minor issues to address. But even so, the brilliant aesthetics, fantastic soundtrack, and heartwarming, compelling story brought Mika's world to life in a way that comes close to realizing its full potential. With some additional work on adding more content and variety through its early access period, Mika and the Witch's Mountain can definitely get there. That said, my rating reflects the game in its current state and not based on any future updates. As many of you know, we at I Dream of Indie Games rate titles with our bronze, silver, and gold genie lamps signifying a good, great, or absolutely essential game, respectively, as well as the indie Krampus, which only comes out if things go horrifically wrong. And accordingly, as a really solid experience that's absolutely worth a play if you're not willing to wait, I'm giving Mika and the Witch's Mountain the bronze genie lamp of approval.